Imagine this. You just fought in World War II. You have seen your friends die next to you in the battlefield and in the trenches. Countless nights of sleep have been lost due to the people screaming in pain. And when the war is over, you don't have much money, and you might not have a house anymore. Then you hear of the GI Bill, designed so war veterans can have discounts on houses and another chance at a better education so you can have a better job. When you apply for the GI Bill benefits, you get rejected, even though you fill all the qualities. You got rejected because of the color of your skin, and your years of painful service won't be recognized by your country. Economic discrimination was and has been a vital method that is used to disadvantage African Americans. The government, laws and restrictions, and many other things have contributed to this active threat to black people in the United States. Ever since the end of slavery, discriminatory practices have run rampant and affected African Americans. Systematic racism in the economy shows one thing that consistently occurs. Throughout history, African Americans have been disadvantaged economically. The roots of economic discrimination against people of color in the United States run deep and all the way back to the 1800s. Laws and policies designed to maintain racist power structures have existed since the beginning of time and have continued even after the formal abolishment of slavery. Legal status of slavery has always been irrelevant. Throughout history, people have found loopholes in the system. Slavery has continued to exist as just taken on different forms and names throughout the years. An example of this sort of institutionalized racism in post-slavery America was the Black Codes, a series of laws that controlled the social and economic lives of black people by making it impossible for them to work a job outside of domestic and farming work. They were entirely controlled by the white landowners under these laws and rules and made it impossible for the people working the jobs to leave the farm. This was slavery by a new name. The 13th Amendment may have abolished slavery on paper, but in practice little changed. These black codes paved the way for Jim Crows, laws in the South which segregated African Americans and reinforced a culture which separated them in ways such as segregated bathrooms, fountains, restaurants, etc. For these reasons, even after the abolishment of slavery, there was still a narrative of white authority and black inferiority. African Americans have not only been targeted socially, they've been attacked economically. Excluding people of color from economic incentives has been a tactic used to maintain unfair power dynamics in society. One example of economic discrimination is the New Deal, which was created during the Great Depression. The New Deal was a series of programs, projects, and financial incentives brought in by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to reinvigorate the troubled economy and assist people in getting back on their feet. Black people were entirely singled out and excluded from the advantages that this brought to U.S. citizens. Black people were denied jobs in many places and they were obligated to go into a certain field of work. Once this was achieved, laws were made which almost permanently separated whites from blacks. They were also denied loans and mortgages even if they were eligible for them. This led to them not having access to certain kinds of housing in places that white people did have access to, which caused an even bigger division. An example to show this separation is the average unemployment rate for whites during the Great Depression being 31.7%, while for African Americans it was well over 50%. There's a long-standing pattern in the United States of discriminatory practices that prevented black people from accumulating wealth. Black people have had fewer advantages with jobs and accumulating wealth ever since the end of slavery. Since emancipation, many laws and restrictions have prevented black people from making a stable amount of wealth, which could be passed down from generation to generation because of how their ancestors were disadvantaged and unable to create strong roots, as we discussed earlier. Jessica Welburn-Page, a behavioral/social scientist from the RAND Corporation, elaborates on these points in the article, "To help African Americans gain generational wealth, look to the housing market." The housing market is an obvious example of this generational wealth disparity that exists between African Americans and white people. According to Welburn-Page, one of the most significant contributors to the racial wealth gap is that African Americans are less likely than white Americans to own homes. She also touches on more points such as homes owned by African Americans are often appraised at lower values than homes owned by white Americans, even when all other factors about the home are equal. The homes in one area are becoming cheaper, while in result turns the homes in other places too expensive for people to move into. In the 1950s, the housing market in America was characterized by segregation, and some of the divisions established at this time remain intact today. In the 1950s, metropolitan areas were home to more than half the U.S. population, and the largest metro areas contained half the U.S. wealth. Not surprisingly, these areas were 90% white. This division of wealth was by design. Redlining was a racist banking policy where the bankers marked areas on a map that were red and green. They would mark areas with the highest percentage of black residents as red declining areas. Areas that were farthest from red and had no black residents were labeled green or best areas. When black people in those communities tried to take out a loan so they could leave the red community, the bank would refuse because they lived in a hazardous area. The The banks were trying to keep all the black residents in one spot so that they wouldn't move into a green or blue desirable community. In the black communities, it was almost impossible to leave the red areas or accumulate wealth. Some more recent data shows, in 2019, the average white family made $76,000 per year, while the average black family made only $46,000 per year. Making less money means that you can't pay for a large home or move out of a once segregated area. Now the average white person lives in a neighborhood where only 75% of residents are white and only 8% are black. The average black person lives in a neighborhood where 45% of people are black and 35% are white. Decades after segregation ended, many areas are still mostly white because of the redlining and the accumulation of wealth in the mid-1900s. Over 80% of low-income black people live in a city with other low-income black people. Even now, many parts of America seem as segregated as ever. Data shows that if black people and white people have the same opportunities to make money ever since the emancipation, the gap would be 3 to 1, but instead it's double that. When you drive through or around Boston, you might drive through the suburbs surrounding it that were primarily white neighborhoods with nice houses. And a few miles away, you would drive through a neighborhood like Roxbury, which is 50% black, with apartments that used to be a redlined area. The problem is many black people still live in those areas and don't have enough money to move out. And the people who live in the nice big houses in the suburbs are mostly white people. The phenomenon known as white flight refers to white people moving out of big cities, specifically diverse neighborhoods, and into suburbs occupied by people that look like them. This contributed to the creation of racially separated neighborhoods, which can be observed in many places in the U.S. today. White flight was a factor, but there were also other reasons that black populations were funneled into neighborhoods with housing that was with other black people. White people were able to move to places such as suburbs because they could afford it, and the government encouraged this. For these reasons, neighborhoods are still divided by race even today, even if the government still isn't actively doing this. For example, in Boston, Back Bay is 76% white, while Roxbury is 56.9% black. These neighborhoods are very close to each other, yet there's a drastic difference in the racial demographic of these two Boston neighborhoods. Another idea that relates to this is redlining. As we discussed earlier, redlining is when loans are not given to people who live in certain neighborhoods because of the neighborhoods that they lived in being considered hazardous by the government or banks in the surrounding areas. This could also be used to explain why Back Bay and Roxbury have such drastic differences in their racial makeup, even if they are close together. If you look at this picture of redlining in Boston, you can see the blue as desirable and the red as hazardous. A good part of Back Bay is still desirable, while all of Roxbury is considered hazardous. Near the end of World War II, a bill was passed in 1944 called the GI Bill, which would help veterans buy houses and pay for college. This might have helped white veterans, but it didn't benefit black veterans in any way, even though they're the ones who needed it the most. The suburbs were shut off completely from the black community, even if the houses were eligible to be bought with the GI Bill. Eugene Burnett was a black World War II veteran, and he saw the houses in the suburbs that he wanted to buy with the help of the GI Bill. He wasn't able to pay for it because of the neighborhood being closed off to black people. Eugene's wife, Bernice, said, "It was as though it wasn't real. Look at this house. Can you imagine having this? And then for them to tell me because of the color of my skin that I can't be a part of it?"
I went up to the salesman. "We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out?" So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, "Listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes."
A similar thing happened to Bill Dabney, who was also a black veteran. He had fought in Europe and was honored by the French, but when he got back home in the South, his family was trying to get a loan with help of the GI Bill. They were trying to get a house in Roanoke, one of the most segregated cities in the United States at the time. His family wasn't directly denied the loans, but the banks kept prolonging the loan and not giving it to the family because of redlining. 75 years after his service in the Army, Lawrence Brooks and his daughter Vanessa Brooks are still striving to get rewards from the GI Bill. Lawrence was one of the 500,000 African-American soldiers that qualified for the GI Bill rewards, but never got them. Historian Matthew Delmos said, "They were denied access to mortgages. They were denied college tuition to be able to go to college and earn degrees that could help them get good jobs afterwards. Thousands of black soldiers that were in the war and asked for their GI Bill benefit were denied because of the color of their skin. And even now, the government doesn't want to give them the benefits that their ancestors should have gotten. Lawrence and Vanessa are just one example of that. This also happened in Levittown, New York in the early and the middle 1900s. Abraham Levitt and his sons had a company that built cheap, one-story houses. Each house cost around $8,000, and with the help of the GI Bill, it could change it to cost $4,500 or even $400. Levittown would also allow black people to buy homes, even the World War II veterans. Most of the residents said that they didn't want to live in a mixed community. After a court case, black people were allowed to buy the houses, but the town was still segregated until the Brown v. Board case in 1954.
Except in one respect. William Myers, Jr. and his family are Negroes in an all-white community. Levittown reacted in a number of ways to the new arrivals. There were several hundred who congregated on the street in front of the Myers house, and there were those among them who felt strongly enough to throw a rock through the picture window. But there was another large group who were repelled by this kind of behavior and organized to help Levittown accept its first Negro neighbors. The vast majority of Levittowners went peacefully about their daily activities, but in the stores and at the schools and on the front lawns, Levittowners discussed the Myers.
The economy is still being affected by redlining and other racist banking policies. Black World War II veterans that served our country weren't recognized after all the horrors they experienced. Even now, their descendants haven't gotten the benefits they should have. The black community has been given less opportunities than the white community because of economic racism in our country. The majority of people that lived in redline neighborhoods are black. Black people today are negatively affected by the racism of the past. Everyone in the world is equal, but it sure doesn't feel that way for many black people in America. In the 1930s, Roxbury was colored completely red on the redlining chart, and today Roxbury is 56% black. Many of the people that lived in Roxbury in the 1930s couldn't move to another neighborhood, and many people still can't, with today's median household income being $40,000 a year. Redlining is still affecting people and is still a problem today. In conclusion, throughout history there has been an irrefutable amount of evidence that showcases how African Americans have and are still affected by racist banking policies and the government. The struggle with jobs and accumulating wealth has drastically altered the racial wealth gap, and it shows. In the end, all this information shows one thing. Throughout history, African Americans have been disadvantaged economically.